Welcome to the Sherpa Search on Tech podcast. This is your host, Maciej Szczerba. I help technology companies to recruit experts and managers. In the podcast, I talk with my guests, industry experts and thought leaders, about topics at the intersection of business, technology, and the development of civilization. Hello everyone, welcome to Sherpa Search on Tech. In today's episode, my guest is Kacper Łodzikowski, who is both a data scientist and a linguist, and R&D Manager at Pearson, a company he has been with for many years. At the same time, a lecturer at the University of Poznań, where he's dealing with students, which will become relevant at some point of our conversation later on. So, Kacper, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Maciej.
So, as a person who's both a linguist and a data scientist, dealing with generative models and dealing with language for many years, what is your take on the ChatGPT hype?
Well, it's interesting that you should ask about this, because I noticed while discussing this with my friends and colleagues over the past couple of weeks that I am generally quite skeptical about the hype. And I say that as a person who lives off AI, leading AI teams and projects, and as a linguist who observed how, over the past 4 years, these types of models rose to mass awareness. But I've got to say, I find myself frequently either disagreeing with my friends and colleagues from other tech teams or other product teams who are so overhyped about it. So I notice I'm starting to focus on the limitations and on the risks rather than opportunities, which is interesting, given that everyone focuses on the opportunities.
So what are the risks, mainly, in your opinion?
I think that we are, with these types of large language models, such as ChatGPT, at a place where they are, let's say, 95% good for a wide range of tasks. Text summarization, text generation, information retrieval. But I think few people realize that the journey from 95% to 100% for certain types of business problems that require 100% accuracy on those tasks is still quite long. And I would say that this mimics what we saw with the rise of neural networks back in 2011, where we had business problems that operated fine with traditional statistical learning systems, but just because neural networks appeared, people started to, especially product people who maybe appreciated the limitations of neural networks less, such as the large amount of data needs for training. Those kinds of people really wanted to go, for their businesses and products to use neural networks, mainly because that was the next best thing, and they didn't want to miss the hype. So I think we are noticing a similar situation here, where there are tasks, and I'll give you one example. I think all sorts of chatbots that operate today for customer service, for sales, I think these chatbots, based on those types of models that we, as a humanity, developed in the past couple of years, they work more or less fine. The GPT model could operate better, could provide better quality, but also, as a company, you need to remember that it comes with the potential for toxic and potentially biased or hateful speech. So you need to put some sort of safeguards around it. So slapping GPT all over your business processes and technologies won't make them immediately better. I think there are some trade-offs to be considered here to make sure that the quality of that system is 100%.
I put a poll on LinkedIn recently, and 50% of the votes indicated that we are not prepared for ChatGPT so far. So to me, ChatGPT is a kind of black swan. It came totally out of sudden. We didn't expect anything like that to arise. I remember when GPT-3 was introduced. I don't know when was it. I think it was autumn 21. So this was quite hyped, but only in the AI ML kind of community.
Exactly.
Whereas ChatGPT is all over the press, and probably my or your shopkeeper knows quite a lot about it already.
And I think it's on us to keep educating people all around us, especially I would say non-technical people who maybe work on product functions, about the limitations. So you've mentioned GPT-3, and that essentially ChatGPT is an agent trained with some reinforcement learning methods on top of GPT-3. And then people kind of, I guess, realize this nowadays, and they played around with it, and they know what it can do. But then they mainly read the media, headlines, and have a very superficial understanding of what it actually is, how it works. And I'll give you one example. I had a conversation last week with a product leader who is really into GPT-3 and ChatGPT, with quite superficial, non-technical understanding of how it works. He and I had a conversation about how to ensure we can detect ChatGPT created content that maybe learners may produce, and then use ChatGPT or GPT-like models to submit a piece of homework, such as an essay, and how to help the teacher detect that, and because that will disrupt the entire educational system. And he told me that, well, OpenAI has got it figured already, because he saw a blog post from OpenAI saying that they now made the detector model available, but he didn't actually read the entire post, which said that the results are quite disappointing, to say the least, currently, because I think the accuracy of that model is about 25 or 26%. So the model struggles still with detecting. OpenAI's own model struggles with detecting ChatGPT content, and also it actually mislabels human created content as AI generated. So that's, I guess, the kind of education and the sort of going behind the media headlines that you and I have to continue to do, not least through your podcast.
So we have a tech crisis, one can say, at the very moment. I don't think we have economic crisis. I think that the money printed out in COVID time was all pumped into tech business, because digitization speeded up in the time of COVID. Some estimate by some 10 years. And everybody hoped that this will go forever, or at least for a couple of years. And there is another tech boom. Looks like we have already, I mean, as business, as humankind, digitized what was to be digitized, and big tech has no idea how to reinvent itself. There's a lot of talk about metaverse. There's talk about big tech entering into fintech, into digital payments more. Several ideas, but with the introduction of ChatGPT, do you think it could be generative AI that will emerge from this crisis of big tech?
That's an interesting observation. I think I agree with you. Late last year, in October, November, so before the ChatGPT hype started, we noticed that, you know, as part of the general recession, the field of AI itself, which was one of the hottest fields in IT, was affected by the recession. So you could see divestments from certain types of AI startups. And I'll give you one example: autonomous vehicles. So one of the poster childs for AI from, you know, 20s to 14 up until last year, you know, Ford and Volkswagen both invested millions of dollars into AI startups that were supposed to create the self-driving capabilities for their own products. And they estimated that by last year, we're going to have mass adoption of self-driving Ford and Volkswagen vehicles. And obviously, that didn't happen for many reasons. But one of those reasons was that, and then I would say it's the same. What, you know, you and I can sort of intuitively observe with generative AI at this point, that those solutions for autonomous vehicles performed well on demos. They were 90% good. They were maybe 95% good. But for that particular context, where you need 100% accuracy and reliability for sort of high stakes scenarios like driving people around town, we noticed that it's a high bar to well, that progress doesn't scale linearly. There are certain points where you get to a point where you are at a certain peak, and you think maybe that you'll be able to progress more quickly, but then you go into a valley. And I think generative AI, despite all the, and that's why I kind of find myself, you know, looking back at computer vision and reinforcement learning, so previous types of AI technologies that were supposed to, I guess, totally disrupt and revolutionize all our economy and businesses. I do see value in generative models and an opportunity to evolve fields such as education. But then I've got to say that my prior knowledge of how AI technologies were actually commercially implemented successfully, that, I guess, biases me a bit towards being skeptical as to whether the huge amounts of investments into generative text and image AI, whether that will actually pan out and actually provide return on investment that we hope for.
The Economist wrote about a possibility of a race between big tech on inventing a competitor for ChatGPT, which was acquired, let's say, through OpenAI by Microsoft, which pulled out to the front of the race at the very moment. So, do you believe that Meta, Google, and Amazon will get into the race together with the Communist Party of China?
Well, you addressed two great points here. One is the competition between tech companies, and the other one is the political aspects of the possible upcoming Cold War between China and the US. I guess we can get to that later, and how that may impact technology. You know, I think
it's already there.
Oh yeah, and you could see that with, you know, the embargoes, you know, the US embargoes on graphical processing units, your GPU chips, and I think even people who worked in US citizens who worked in China for those types of industries. So yeah, I agree. You know, to a certain extent, that is already here, and it is expanding into AI. And I just hope that AI as a field, and AI researchers especially those who focus on the use of AI for good purposes, like fighting climate change or, you know, improving people's well-being, I hope that doesn't impact those groups of researchers, because that will be you know, weaponizing AI and limiting access to models or model training technology. because of a cold, political trade war, that will be disappointing. That'll be a shame. But coming back to your question about big tech, I think it's interesting, maybe ironic, in the sense that the very technology, the foundational technology behind large language models such as GPT, which is the transformer architecture for language processing, that came out of Google, I think back in 2016-ish. And so Google was the pioneer for when it comes to those types of models. And then you could see that on their blog, they already scrambled to showcase their own breakthroughs in natural language processing and text generation and image generation. They had a nice series of blog posts by Jeff Dean published, I think, a couple of weeks ago. And we also see, other companies like Anthropic and their models, and open source models like Bloom, so created by a community of AI scientists around the world. So I think OpenAI hit that was a good marketing, good timing for sure, good marketing hype. The technology, it isn't anything that other companies, I would say, don't have already. It's just that they nailed it in terms of the rollout and the free research preview that everyone is now using.
That's very interesting. I also heard about consortia of researchers that are working on generative models.
Yeah, and I think I would say if you look at one thing that people are focusing so much these days, especially when envisioning what GPT-4 will look like, is model size, which is how much of the data the model can memorize in a way. And if you look at some of the initial transformer-based models like BERT from Google, which I think was from around 2016, 2017, so models which still perform well on certain types of tasks for natural language understanding, like understanding search queries, or natural language generation. So with BERT, which is a simpler model compared to GPT, you can generate text as well, but it works better for, I would say, shorter sentences than entire paragraphs. But back when that model was released, you would need an entire server farm to train it, and it would still take a couple of days, maybe weeks. And these days, thanks to companies such as Hugging Face, which make models available in a smaller distilled format, you can, as a single researcher, with a reasonable amount of time, a couple of days, and maybe $2,000, train your own version of BERT, the distilled BERT model. So it's not only a domain of those big companies. Obviously, these are the companies that make the model, that design and train the models in the first place, and then they open source it. But I would say over the next 2-3 years, we're going to see a welcome democratization when it comes to the ability for groups of researchers at institutions, or maybe even individual researchers, to actually train or their own big models, language models, and that's because those models will be made available in smaller formats, and also the computing power is becoming more available and also cheaper.
In the cloud era. That's very interesting. I wasn't aware of that so much, to be very honest. I just read in the same article I mentioned, but it looks like it's more competition than let's say ordinary people are aware of. You mentioned that these large language models are more and more trained on synthetic data. When we talked that like offline, this is a very interesting issue, because this training language model upon synthetic data can result in huge falsifications of our, let's say, consciousness, perception, and so on. Could you relate to that?
I think it has been an issue for AI researchers for many years now. It's only now that it's actually being surfaced for others to understand. If you look at Google Translate over the years, they struggled tremendously with developing translation models because the way you develop a translation model, like one of the ways is you scrape a lot of websites where usually if you go to a website, if it's a shop, for example, a blog, usually you have a version in Polish and in English. And so that's an easy pair of texts written in one language or another. But the problem that Google researchers cannot really control is that if a Polish person sets up their own shop website in Polish and they create the English version of the website, they actually use Google Translate often in the first place to do it, which then introduces already noise into the entire system. And I believe that there are certain languages such as Hindi that up until recently Google Translate struggled with because those pairs of websites were actually mostly synthetic texts. So the Hindi was written in the original language, but then the English equivalents were synthetic to start with. And it's the same, and we are continuing to see the same problem with large language models like ChatGPT. If you go back to that blog post from last week by OpenAI, where they introduced the model for detecting ChatGPT content, they said that they trained it, among others, on two corpora of text. One corpus was what they believe was human generated, and the other one was what they believe to be AI generated. So even large companies which seem to be at the very peak of understanding how to create those models, they also struggle with creating data sets which are representative and maybe free of synthetic data, which are and free of bias. So I think it's this is not going away, and it is, I think, also becoming a problem for data science teams at other companies that try to work with data. So imagine an online retailer, for example, and user reviews that the data science team wants to process and analyze the sentiment of users, whether they like certain products or whether they dislike them. And you can be sure these days that a percentage of those reviews is synthetic, and you cannot really, with the quality of those models that people use, you cannot really say. Yeah, I think and it's up to, this is up to then the data science team then to try and learn how to detect those reviews, because if you rely on data that comes in from the web, and you cannot trust these days that it's generated by a human and hasn't, and I don't mean only humans, but even someone's use of Google Translate. Someone wanted to write a review, but they but they only speak Polish, so they use Google Translate or another service to translate it into English, which in itself may introduce some bias and change the tone of the review maybe. So I think it's good, just like over the past couple of years, data science teams at all sorts of companies needed to upskill, from the good old days of big data and Hadoop towards training machine learning models. And deploying them and monitoring them on production. I think the next step now is for those teams to upskill again and enhance their expertise to include the ability to detect fake or generated or synthetic data, so that they can make a conscious decision as to which parts of the data to introduce. If they don't want to introduce the synthetic data into their own modeling and data analysis, then they should be able to detect that data in the first place.
In your opinion, do large language models extend or limit human creativity?
Well, I think we're going to see over the next couple of years. In my own experimenting with those types of models, I noticed that they help me with writer's block, and I ran a similar poll on my students of AI at the Adams University in Poznań, and they also agreed that it's good to get your ideas going, but then the human actually needs to take over pretty quickly in the process. Those students that I mentioned, they tried to use ChatGPT to write bits of their MA thesis, and that didn't work. Not least because the model misunderstands certain concepts, or it makes up references, and then if you ask it whether a given reference is false, it then goes into a spiral saying it's false, and then that it's true, and then false again, so it kind of hallucinates. I think when it comes to text, I see a lot of opportunity, which we can discuss later, when it comes to, let's say, education and learning how to write in general. But also, and I think that's something we talk about less in terms of generative AI, and that's models that help people generate code. This is something that I think will help people be more creative, in the sense that people who are code illiterate, in a way that they don't yet have the ability to code fluently, but they would like to express their ideas and build something maybe, or analyze data, or just do something, automate something. I think the large language models fine-tuned for code generation, such as Alpha Code from DeepMind, or Copilot, Codex from OpenAI and GitHub and Microsoft. I think that is I hope that's going to lower the entry barrier for people to code, and with the entire idea for Web 3.0 and what the metaverse could be, and the fact that we still lack trained professionals who know how to code in all sorts of languages. I think in that area we could actually see more creativity, but the generative model for code will be, I guess, a tool that helps people build stuff, and that's where the creativity will come from.
Coming back to your students, will they still write essays?
That's a great question. So we're actually so I posted on LinkedIn a couple of weeks ago a poll from my students. So we were supposed to have a test at the end of the semester in the AI course, and prior to the test, I ran a quick poll asking the students whether they think it's okay for them to use ChatGPT in the test, because the test was, it was digital. It was with a computer lab. It's an AI course, and I forget the result, but I think 2/3 of them said, 2/3 of them I think said it's okay, or maybe it's not okay. I forget the result, but I guess it was like more or less a 50-50 split. There was a group who said it's okay for them to use this, and a group who said that they either didn't want to use it, or they thought I wouldn't appreciate them using it. But then they thought, well, since I asked, maybe they should use it. And I specifically extended the time of the test to just give them time to actually play around with ChatGPT, and I encouraged them to do it. And after the test, I think 2/3 of students said they did find ChatGPT helpful in some way, but then 1/3 of students said they didn't find it helpful. They either didn't use it because they didn't want to waste time, or they used it and they got confusing answers. Some questions were open-ended, some questions were close-ended, and even on the open-ended question, some students got good results, others got confusing results. So the consensus was, I guess, that it's a digital skill, just like using the calculator or using MS Word and Excel, that we should encourage young people to learn and to understand the contexts in which using that tool performs better, and contexts in which using that tool performs poorer. And another piece of research that I'll mention here, which I think is interesting. A couple of weeks ago, a study was published, I think from Harvard, which showed that the researchers grouped students, mostly students and mostly junior programmers, into two groups. One got coding tasks and used OpenAI's Codex model to help them produce the coding results, the code. And then the other group didn't use Codex. And the group that used Codex, they actually created code. They wrote code that had more security vulnerabilities than the other group, which didn't use Codex. And the group that used Codex also, when asked, thought that the quality of their code was better than the other groups that didn't use Codex. So that's another example where, you know, even people's own perception of whether a tool is helpful is potentially biased. Just because they use a tool doesn't mean that they actually know how to use it.
Yeah, it's like this famous meme that is actually true, that ChatGPT thinks that Leo Messi still plays for Barcelona. It was all over social media. Let's say going down to business. What is basically your role as an R&D manager, and what Pearson does? Because your company is mostly associated with textbooks, which is just only a tiny part of its business, isn't it?
Thank you for recognizing that. So my role at Pearson is I'm the Vice President of AI Learning Capabilities, and Pearson is the world's leading digital media learning company, and my group's role at Pearson is twofold. First, we design and develop all sorts of AI capabilities that I can talk about later for the entire business. And then also we focus on internal and external thought leadership when it comes to the application of AI in education. And Pearson, I think in Poland is mainly known for just one of its pillars, which is English language learning. And like you said, it started back in the day, many decades ago with acquiring the Longman business, which is very well known in Poland. And over the years, it evolved from print textbooks or offering just print textbooks to offering digital products as well. So entire learning experiences, be it digital platforms or mobile apps or sort of hybrid solutions. And I think the COVID pandemic only helped to accelerate that, and much like with ChatGPT and the discussion around whether students should or should not be allowed such tools, the pandemic accelerated the sort of shift, the mindset shift from traditional print learning into digital first learning.
So what are, let's say, major trends in AI-backed education nowadays?
So actually, let me just start by giving more context to our listeners and tell them how the educational market actually looks like today, because I think it's interesting. Education is usually, if you look at any given country's GDP, it's usually the second item on the list after healthcare. So it's usually a pretty big business. It's a pretty big market, and it's estimated to be at around $5 trillion currently, and
globally.
I think yes, globally, and it'll grow to $7 trillion by 2030, more or less. And if you look at how the past couple of years, and especially the pandemic, accelerated the shift to digital and other related trends, such as lifelong learning and how people now change careers frequently, and how companies became, in a way, new universities because they invest in their employees and their upskilling so much that there's a lot of opportunities in the broad sort of learning or education market to implement technology and implement AI. And I'll give you just a couple of examples from what Pearson does.
Yeah, this is the very interesting part.
One example is, a very traditional example is English language learning. So something that our listeners in Poland will be familiar with. If you look at how language learning has looked like over the past decades, it was a piece of text. You would read the text, maybe you would listen to something, and then you would complete mostly close-ended activities, so multiple choice activities, fill in the gap activities, and so on. And with AI, you can now evolve that towards more authentic assessment of your skills, because we can now use natural language processing or NLP models similar to GPT or BERT to generate content that's tailored to your needs. If you make an error in a particular, if you struggle with a particular grammatical structure in English, like the present perfect, for example, we can now use those models to generate hundreds or thousands or millions of examples in varied contexts at particular difficulty level, which are tailored just for you, so that you can actually practice that particular sentence or structure if you need it. And that also goes to new ways of interaction between the machine and the human. So we are now moving away from multiple choice questions towards activities in which you describe an image using your own words in writing or verbally, or in which you listen to a recording, maybe it's a lecture, maybe it's a conversation, and then you retell it using your own words. So this is a paradigm shift towards more authentic assessment, where you can speak freely or write freely. That's one example from this English language vertical as to how AI can be implemented.
Can you share your experience, including, let's say, your hints and not to do's in managing R&D teams, and when especially in the context of managing R&D teams who dealing with generative models and synthetic data?
Well, there are many, and I think the main challenge that I think every R&D manager will encounter at a certain time in their career is that R&D is hard, and it requires long-term focus and a long-term investment. And I think it's a part of this tension comes from the business's expectation for a quick turnaround, because if you start developing a product, you are usually late. Others are developing similar products. Maybe they have a product in the market already. So if you develop a product, you really want to get results quick. And even with traditional software development, you can get quick results if you organize your work properly, if you run an agile team and so on. But then in an R&D team, such as an AI team or any other type of an R&D team, this is quite different, because you accumulate know-how over time, and it's only over time. It is more future-facing research and development compared to product, which is kind of a catch-up game. So
foreseeable.
Yeah, in a way. So trying to balance the future-facing long-term research with the need for a quick turnaround and delivering incremental business value, I think that's something that at a certain point in their career, everyone will probably struggle with. I noticed interesting over the years shift in my own team, and then how my team presents their results and how they talk about work, and that we no longer commit to delivering a particular AI feature for a given date. We commit to conducting R&D on the ability to deliver that feature, and then we kind of create a roadmap with milestones and so on. but we try to educate our product colleagues that AI is an experiment-driven, and R&D in general is an experiment-driven process, and you can never guarantee that you will get the final outcome on time or within budget, or even if you'll get there, maybe you'll get to a dead end, which in itself could be a valuable lesson, or maybe you will actually get to an outcome which is slightly different from what you initially aimed at, and that in itself might be actually a better outcome, or it might be slightly worse. So this is something that if I was of all the lessons, if I were to pick like number one, is just the importance of educating stakeholders and managing expectations as to how R&D process works.
Do they let them? Do they let convince themselves about uncertainty in R&D projects?
I would say generally yes. Some people need more education and more examples. Others need less of that. I think it's on the R&D team to understand that it is their responsibility to educate others, and that a company in itself, won't really do it for them. At the end of the day, a business is not an org chart; it's a group of people, and the fact that you need to build relationships and work with people real close and build that trust, that is paramount. So I would say focus on building good relationships with people, and probably you'll get to a point where you've got that trust.
Right. So, any reflection on what's good leadership in R&D? Is it different anyhow?
Well, I
from
noticed
other leadership models.
So let me tie this to our previous point, where I noticed in myself over the years an interesting shift. I think I made my number one mistake up until recently, and maybe still I do it sometimes today, is that I would blame everything else and others and the context and the company and the market for bad results, instead of taking full ownership of the actual deliverable. And I would say, because there's this concept of extreme ownership, which I really like, from a book written by Joker Willink and Leif Babin called Extreme Ownership, which talks about.
Heard about it.
I recommend that book to all our viewers and listeners. It's a book written by two ex-Navy SEALs, which combines the stories as the leadership principles they learned on the battlefield, which then they translate into their leadership consultancy. So they are, I think they're quite big in the US right now. And they wrote a couple of books. The first one was Extreme Ownership, and it was a really humbling lesson to me to read that book and to reflect on my big leadership mistake over the years, which was to, whenever my team didn't deliver something, I would usually try and find the root cause elsewhere. I would blame, the market or other teams or the ways of working or lack of budget or lack of time, whatever. And I guess the core learning from that book, which now drives most of how my team works, because I had everyone else read the book as well and discuss it with me and share their thoughts, was that we always try to take this extreme ownership of everything that has to do with our team, which is quite liberating, I got to say, because at the end of the day, then it puts you in the driving seat of your R&D project or group, and it actually, if the problem is with another team, like we said, it's maybe we need to educate someone. If the problem is that someone doesn't actually understand the R&D cycle on the product side, we don't leave it at that. We actually it's our responsibility to help educate that person and bring them on board and build the trust and so on. Same with time and budget. If we cannot deliver a certain milestone, then it's on us to flag this as soon as possible and see if there's anything we can do to maybe deliver it incrementally over time, and we maybe split the team. So it turns in, from complaining into feeling more empowered to actually bring change about. So in terms of leadership, if I can recommend one thing, that would be that extreme ownership approach. I think it applies throughout all life areas, not only R&D.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I will have a look at the book. Amazing. Definitely. You're responsible for venture investing, right?
So I as part of my role, I advise a group called Pearson Ventures, which is an internal group formed in 2019 that deals with both investing in EdTech startups as well as acquiring companies into the Pearson portfolio.
So could you tell us what are the trends in EdTech at the moment?
EdTech is
what you are focusing at, if you can say, if you can
sure.
tell us.
EdTech is pretty hot these days. If you look at 2015, there was pretty much no EdTech and no organized EdTech investment. There wasn't a venture fund focusing just on EdTech, for example, as opposed to other areas of technology at the intersection of other domains. So that changed as part of the pandemic. You now have a variety of startups that try to disrupt education with technology, with AI, across all types of education. And I'll give you one example. If we go back to language learning, which we discussed, so that we kind of ground the discussion in those tangible examples that I described. Many EdTech startups these days look at promising AI technologies such as ChatGPT or GPT-3, and they build a quick product around it. They release it into the public. They maybe get some traction, and when they come to us looking for investment, we frequently turn them down because we learned the hard way over the years of transformation from a print business to a digital business with a central strong AI function, that treating learning as an engineering problem doesn't work. So you cannot just take a piece of technology, however promising, slap it all over a traditional model and hope for it to help people learn or help people pass exams. Over the years, Pearson has invested a lot of time and effort into an approach we call efficacy. So we try to create educational products similarly to how drugs are created by pharmaceutical companies, and that we focus really on what the outcome should be. Then we apply learning science and technology and UX into the process. And the focus on learning science, which is understanding how people learn and how to best design a product that helps people learn, that comes first. And then we actually focus on which particular technology to choose. Is it a traditional machine learning approach, which still works in many cases, or is it should it be a neural network based approach, or should it be our model or a pre-trained model from OpenAI? And I think that process is different from how an AI startup usually treats a problem, where they would look at a piece of technology first, try to apply it to a problem, and then find out that doesn't necessarily mean that they solved the problem or that they disrupted the education space.
I think it's a common problem among startups in general, that they don't focus on a problem in the first place. I've had a very interesting conversation on my podcast recently with Martyna Tarnowska about design thinking. And I think design thinking is something that is great to implement into education. What's your take on that?
Oh yeah, definitely, and it is something that we try to implement in how we create our products, because we talk to educators and students alike, and education is actually really interesting in that you usually have two competing clients. If we look at English language learning, for example, if you look at the institutional context, so a classroom with a teacher and the students, they are both customers, and also the parent is a customer, and sometimes they have competing or conflicting interests, and
Contradictory views, at least.
come again?
Contradictory views, at least.
Yes, yes. So then using processes such as design thinking or design sprints, where you actually take a group of stakeholders and a scrum team, and you run a focused week-long design sprint, that actually frequently helps to find out what the balance is between the competing points of view of the customers, as well as what learning science tells us about how people learn. Because if you many people would say that they learning is boring, and that they would like for learning to be more fun, and that's sometimes what startups try to do, saying that their approach for building a chatbot using GPT is fun, and that it makes learning fun. But then what we know from learning science is that learning is a demanding, cognitively demanding process that by definition should be hard and challenging. So kind of finding that balance
I agree.
between making a product that is engaging and sufficiently fun to use, but also not really turning it into a Netflix of education, because that's really not how learning works. So I totally think that design thinking has it's a very strong place in education.
Last but not least, I always ask this question to people who are both in the academia world and in the business world. What both worlds can learn from each other?
What the academia can learn from the business, and the other way around,
and vice versa.
Okay. It is an interesting question, because if you look at the field of AI, especially over the past years, the movement of ideas and people has mainly been one way. It was from the academia into the business, and there are certainly that research mindset and the focus on long-term progression, building on someone else's thought and then advancing that, and the focus on the long-term vision instead of the short-term milestones. That is something that we really appreciate when we hire people from the academia into the business, because as the focus on the business comes and goes with annual goals and market conditions, but the focus on the fundamental questions of how people learn or how to best use AI, that is a pretty long-term question. So I would say when we look at what business can learn from the academia, I would say that's the long-term focus on research and sort of cumulative value over time, instead of just short-term value goals. And if you look at what the academia could learn from the business, I think it's actually a different side of the same, which is focus on agile-like short turnaround, sort of incremental delivery. I sometimes advise my students on the MA thesis or grant proposals, and I went through a couple of grant proposals myself, and I know how slow the process usually is. If you apply for a grant, for example, it's a long process writing the proposal. You then wait 6 months to get the results back. You then start with your 3-year grant plan, from which you cannot really deviate too much, because you have to submit the grant summary at the end. and sometimes some people finalize year-longs work on grants just because they needed to, and maybe the problem had already been solved by someone else. So I would say that flexibility that the business has, and that sort of short-term focus on goals, which I guess paradoxical. I would like to see more of that in the academia. So if there's a way for us to blend the two worlds, so the academia's long-term focus on advancement, and the business is usually short-term focus on results delivery, I would say we would be in the perfect place for solving some of the world's problems.
Yeah, so it's how to slow down and how to speed up, respectively.
And how to understand when to do which, right?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting perspective. Kacper, thank you very much for having you today. I hope this is not our last conversation on this channel. I think that we all learned quite a lot. And have a great day and great week ahead.
Thanks for having me, Maciej. Thanks to all the listeners. Take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to Sherpa Search on Tech. If you have enjoyed the show, please subscribe to our show wherever you listen. Thanks again. The Sherpa Search on Tech podcast is a production of Sherpa Search, an executive search firm specializing in the tech industry, helping hire the right people for expert and managerial positions, and advising how to build and develop long-lasting, high-performing IT teams. If you would like to learn more, reach out to us at maciej.szczerba@sherpasearch.tech or visit our website sherpasearch.tech. See you next time.